Welcome on in, football fans. It's your boy Gsluke here with our DFS and prop preview for tomorrow's 3-game Thanksgiving slate. We've got ourselves some food on the schedule, some friends, family, maybe some brewskis, and most importantly here, some football out there for Thursday. So, gonna make sure you're ready for all of your action out there tomorrow. With first off, a look at the Draftkings DFS side, what I'm doing out there for the 3-game slate, how I'm treating the slate maybe a little bit differently than most out there, and then afterwards, we're gonna focus on the prop side of things with my underdog and prize picks exposure that I've already gone to at this point. So by the end, gonna have everything taken care of out there for Thanksgiving, outside of all the food and cooking that you're gonna have out there for tomorrow. So let's get after it. Hopefully make Thanksgiving an even better day than it already be, and let's get after it out there for tomorrow. These smaller game slates, whether it's a 2-gamer out there on Monday sometimes, or this 3-gamer that we have on our plate tomorrow, you gotta treat them a little bit differently than every other slate. It's not quite a showdown slate where we only have one game to choose from, and it's also not quite the 10 to 13 gamers that we get out there on the weekend. You have bits and pieces of both types of formats that you have to kind of mix in for a slate like this. So for example, the main slate kind of lineup construction where you have a lot more players to actually jam into a lineup is going to be the exact same out here for this 3-gamer. So with the 3 games, you're going to have to fit more slots into your lineup. But at the same time, because we only have those 3 game environments, correlation and perhaps getting way over the field on one game versus the other 2 is going to really come into play as well. And that's more of the showdown aspect where you're going out there and doing some game scripting. You've got to mix that in with a little bit of that main slate lineup construction to go out there and build some lineups. So we'll talk through the implications of that position by position, but you can't really have the same formula that you guys have been using for every single Sunday slate and use it out there for this. It's just, I would say correlation a lot more important when you only have the 3 games to choose from, and it's real easy to kind of think through, right? If one of these games goes way over its total, maybe has like a 55 to a 65 point over under, that sort of thing, you're gonna have to have at least 4, maybe 5 players from that game out of your 8 or 9 skill position players. So it's important to go out there and consider, and getting over the field and trying correlating for those kind of game scripts is how you can really take advantage of one of these 3 gamers. So we're gonna start at quarterback, go position by position, and what you can see over here are my projections for Thursday. So these are updated as of Wednesday afternoon. Of course, on my Patreon page, you can have everything on this spreadsheet completely up to date. That'll include projections as they change there before lock, and also my entire player pool, which of course is blacked out here on this video. So I got to keep some of the projections there behind the paywall as well. But if you guys want access to everything I have to offer, make sure to download it over there. But you guys are going to get a good idea of where ownership is coming in on this slate with what I have available on here. And then we're also going to talk about some of my potential player pool leans as well. So at the top, you got Jordan Love and also Jared Goff up here, who I kind of want to lump together because they project solidly both in the 18.5 to nearly 19 point range, but they're also coming with some ownership. And on top of that, they're also the 2 most expensive quarterbacks on the slate. It's not like I think either option is terrible. I think if you're going to use them, just correlate it properly with at least 1 pass catcher in each case, if not 2, because these are 2 quarterbacks that aren't really known for their rushing threat. But at the same time, they're going to cost you a lot more than some of these lower tier quarterbacks. And in the case of Caleb Williams, who we'll talk about here in a few minutes, you're not going that far down in terms of projection in a few cases. So I still like Jared Goff, Jordan Love. I think they're more GPP options if you're going after some correlation, but the price tag is going to be prohibitive in a few other spots. I really like spending up at running back on this slate. There's also a few top tier wide receivers that I'm trying to fit into some of my lower tier quarterback stacks, which I can't really accomplish if I'm using a Jared Goff or a Jordan Love up top. So they're in play. They're maybe not my favorite plays out there for tomorrow. And you can see about 22% ownership on Goff, about 21% over there in Jordan Love, which unfortunately means if you're going to try and get leverage to either one of those 2 players, you're looking at least 40% exposure yourself, which is starting to get into that uncomfortable range, which is why he's maybe not my favorite player. Both of these guys, I should say, up there at over $6,000. Tua is much lower owned, so I've got him at just 13.7% in terms of his projected ownership. It's a real tough matchup against the Packers, but if I was playing in a large field GPP where I haven't reserved my contest yet, but I'm probably going to have some single entries and then a lot of large field GPP exposure, when you have a Thanksgiving slate like this, a lot of casuals that don't always play PGA DFS or NFL DFS, like the case we have tomorrow, it's been a lot of golf this fall as well, so you can tell where my brain's at. But when you have a lot of casuals playing tomorrow, you're going to have a bigger edge to go out there and exploit. So somebody like Tua in a large field GPP could be a way to get different at the quarterback position if he can overcome that tough matchup. So I'm not really going to have any Tua shares out there in my single entries, some of my smaller field GPP stuff, as it's not as necessary to go out there and really differentiate to the rest of the field. But in large field GPPs, you've got to take a shot in a few cases on somebody that maybe projects just a hair lower than some of his peers, but that can get you different to the field if he goes out there and hits. What we're usually looking for in those sort of players is upside, right? Any glimmer of hope that they can go out there and still get the job done. And with Tua, you have that. Next up, we got Caleb Williams, who is going to be a little bit higher owned. So personally, I actually like this play a little bit better. As you can see with the projection, he's there at 3.42x points per dollar, which is the best at the quarterback position, but unfortunately comes at 24.1% projected ownership. So if there's chalk at the quarterback position, it would be Caleb Williams, probably because he's way too cheap at $5,300. Not only is going to pass the ball an absolute ton as sizable underdogs against the Lions, but also has the dome atmosphere, relatively high game total there between those two teams, and also has some rushing upside at the quarterback position. So I would say in single entries, some of my smaller field GPPs, I'm probably going to use Caleb Williams quite a bit out here for tomorrow. But in large field GPPs, even some of like those single entries, I might be avoiding them in a few cases, just if I want to get different at the quarterback position. You're going to have plenty of other opportunities to go out there and offset the ownership. So even if you took a Goff, a Love up top, or Williams down here at 24%, you can always get different elsewhere. So it's not the end of the world if you go out there and take a relatively high-owned quarterback, but there are opportunities to perhaps get different to the field. And perhaps my two favorite would be these two cheap quarterbacks out there between the Dallas Cowboys and the Giants. They're, of course, playing each other. You've got backup quarterbacks out there in both cases, which is going to give you a very soft price tag. The projections are low. They're the lowest that you have on the slate. But you can see from the efficiency standpoint that are actually better plays than all three quarterbacks there at the top. So I don't think that they're out of reason at all. You've seen Cooper Rush actually have good production in the last few weeks. And Drew Lock, though it'll be his first time playing this year, as I think an upgrade over DeVito. So he's there at 8.2%. You've got 10.7% ownership over there on a Cooper Rush. If I was playing into large field GPP, I think Tua makes a little bit of sense to get different. But I think these bottom two quarterbacks, Rush and Lock in particular, are probably my favorite to go out there and play in those large field GPPs. So I think you're going to see a lot of the casuals spend up at quarterback. And by the way, the salary is not a huge component of tomorrow's slate. It's very soft pricing out there for Thanksgiving. It's usually what we get for these really large slates with a lot of casuals playing. But Cooper Rush, Drew Lock, you throw one of those two in at quarterback, and you can literally play whoever the heck you want to with your other spots in your lineup. So I think there's upside with going out there and doing so, particularly if you like some of the spends up at running back or wide receiver. But speaking of, we'll go over to running back now, where you can see we've got all the ownership, all the projections up here for this position. And I think a lot of this comes down to your game scripting. Your quarterback is really going to give you a good feel for what game you think is going to shoot out. These running backs, you might want to correlate out there with your defense. And in general, I'm probably not playing a lot of running backs on tomorrow's slate. Out there with the quarterback, I'm going out there and stacking. So in A-Chain, I guess if you were playing Tua stacks, you could potentially use him as some correlation. I'm not a huge fan of the Jared Goff lineups, but I guess Jahmyr Gibbs, you could try and get some correlation there. But outside of like those two, maybe a Rico Dowdle you could use with Cooper Rush, there's not a lot of receiving backs here, right? Like DeAndre Swift, 1 or 2 receptions a game, right? Tyron Tracy, probably 2, maybe 3 receptions at most per game. You have A-Chain at like a 4.5 reception line. You have Jahmyr Gibbs, who I believe is at a 2.5 or a 3.5 line out there in a lot of books. There's a few I guess you could use for a little bit, but unless they're scoring a receiving touchdown, are probably not going to be in the optimal lineup together. So what I more so like doing here are taking guys like a Josh Jacobs, a David Montgomery here at $6,500, who, by the way, if you're a fan of the revenge game narrative, might be worth a few extra looks. They're at 24.6% ownership. these more traditional running backs that get it done with rushing touchdowns, 20 to 25 carries, are the ones that I'm actively looking to stack. So Josh Jacobs as favorites against the Dolphins, I think makes quite a bit of sense out there in the last game. David Montgomery, revenge game, also has 10-point favorites against the Bears. Even if you're using a Caleb Williams at quarterback, maybe the buyback that you're quote-unquote going with are the running backs out there for the Lions. Maybe it's one of the two or even both out there in the same lineup. That is the reason why the Detroit Lions are playing from so far ahead. And of course, if a team is playing from ahead, whether it's the Packers up here or the Lions with the Montgomery or Gibbs, the running backs are going to get more usage out there in the second half. So as mentioned, correlation, game scripting really comes into play on these three gamers, kind of like you'd be going through out there on a showdown slate. And DeAndre Swift is a really tough matchup against the Lions, so he's not my favorite play out there, but is only 16% owned, so really low ownership out there at running back. Tyron Tracy Jr. is also relatively low owned at running back. I would argue is worth the squeeze over there at about 27%, and about 13.1 projected points. He's not going to project off the board, but if he were to go out there and score a touchdown, that's where he's going to get close to that 20 fantasy point mark. And he's already shown us that he's capable of going over 100 rushing yards if the game script cooperates. So perhaps that's how he could get to the optimal lineup as well. Rico Dowdle is a lot chalkier than I thought. In fact, I thought Tracy would be more chalky than Dowdle, even with Tracy being a little bit more expensive. But for whatever reason, maybe it's the receiving upside that Dowdle brings to the table. You can see my projections do favor Dowdle, so perhaps that's part of the reason that you're getting that inflated ownership there. But nearly 50% on Dowdle just makes him a tough play to want to get over the field on. Same thing with Jahmyr Gibbs, even an A-Chain there at like 36%, a Josh Jacobs at 40% ownership. There's not a lot of leverage to be had at this running back position. So I think if you're going to get different, quarterback isn't a terrible place to start to do so, but wide receiver and tight end are where we're going to generate a lot of that leverage. So running back for me is going to be a little bit chalkier. Even some of my quarterback exposure out there with Caleb Williams is probably going to be a little bit chalkier, but when it starts to get to like 50% is where I start to get a little bit worried about it. So between these two, I'd rather have a Tyrone Tracy Jr., and that's even with the Giants being slight underdogs on the road against the Cowboys. In terms of your backups, like a Mostert, he's been starting to get less and less carries as the year has gone on. Devin Singletary still gets snaps and usage out there for the Giants, but unless they're playing from way ahead, is probably not somebody we're going to consider. A Roschon Johnson, with how difficult the matchup is against the Lions, these sort of players, if they vulture a touchdown, they could get there that way, but that's really their only way to the optimal lineup. So what I'm doing with these backups, Ezekiel Elliott, by the way, great track record on Thanksgiving. And Jalen Wright, he's been getting touches out there for the Dolphins. Hunter Lupke, he's been getting touches as like a fullback out there for the Cowboys. Sometimes even just like the short down running back out there for the Cowboys as well. These sort of players are only used in GPPs. I would really say from everyone from Singletary down. So anyone sub $5,000 on the slate, if you guys are playing these in a cash lineup, you're crazy. Horrible play out there in a cash lineup. And even if you're playing them in like a smaller field contest, let's say it's like a couple hundred entry, single entry or something like that, it's not the best idea to go out there and use these kind of players. I think you'd be getting way too cute. These are the kind of players that on a showdown slate you'd be using for some differentiation and leverage, but when they're $4,000, right? The pricing is way different out here for these kind of slates as compared to what we have out there for Showdown. Like these kind of players are normally like, in some cases, especially these like bottom tier guys, like $200 to $400 plays. Now these higher tier options probably like $2,000 to $3,000, but a lot softer pricing than what we have out here for what is main slate pricing. So this is where you start to see some of like the Sunday strategy start to come in. A lot of what we've talked about to this point comes down to what you do for Showdown, but the pricing aspect is really similar to what we have for main slate. And unfortunately, what that does is it makes a lot of these low tier plays not the best punts. And Showdown, meaning their cost next to nothing, there is upside in some cases, but not so much on this kind of slate. Going to wide receiver now, this is where I think there's a little bit more opportunity to go out there and get different. I'm still going to be taking some chalk with my spend ups. So like a CD Lamb, if you're playing a Cooper Rush lineup, I think he's almost a must play. Same thing with Neighbors. If you're going with a Drew Lock-led lineup, I'm not going to be getting different with guys that are 38% owned, 24% owned, like you have out there with Neighbors. Even like a Jameson Williams, Amon-Ra, if you went with a Jared Goff, right? That's not where you're going to get different. It's these bottom tier wide receivers. And while I'm not as ecstatic to go out there and play some of those backup running backs, these wide receivers are a little bit more reasonable. And the main reason for that is that they actually see the field. Some of these backup running backs, unless the team is playing from way ahead, are getting 3, maybe 5 touches a game. And that would be if they're lucky. And as a running back, that's usually like 3 or 4 yards a touch. These wide receivers, they still may only get 3 to 5 touches a game. And that's honestly if they're lucky. In a few cases down low, but they have infinitely more upside to go out there and make it a big play, right? These wide receivers, especially some of these lower tier ones, are more of your big play threats, guys that aren't PPR wide receivers that you're seeing out there for every snap. For example, Odell Beckham Jr. has seen a lot of red zone snaps. He's not playing the most snaps out there for the Dolphins, but you know where he is playing? When they need to get him down there in the red zone, and he can high point the football. You've got guys down here like Malik Washington. He's that gadget player out there for the Dolphins. Not a safe play by any means, but he's shown us that when he has the ball in his hands, that he can take any touch out there for a touchdown. Ryan Flournoy, I've heard great things about him. He's a very physically talented wide receiver. Like, he could go out there and have a really big game. Like, there are guys down here that you can conceivably get to for some leverage. Just to give you guys some injury news, Khalif Raymond is doubtful. These two guys down here that are questionable, you can see I have Doubs currently projected out. Brandon Cooks could be activated before Thursday's game. So these are the sort of players that we're going to want to keep an eye on. But if Dobbs is out, potentially you could look at Datavian Wicks. His projection would go through the roof. In fact, it'd probably be closer to an 11-point projection if we get that news. The ownership's going to be up on a guy like a Wicks, but you've also got guys like a Slane, who I've got at about 1% ownership. At Jalen Tolbert at 2.1%. He's been an active participant of that Dallas offense. Jonathan Mingo, I know he was just traded for, not the best projection, but he could conceivably become a little bit more involved out there in that Dallas offense. A Kevontae Turpin, we've seen him have some big plays out there for the Cowboys. There are a ton of leverage plays down here, right? Wicks probably not a leverage play, but all these other guys that we've talked about, a Odell Beckham Jr., Malik Washington, really any of these punts that are sub $4,000 are going to get you infinitely different to the field. So there are going to be some spots where you just have to eat chalk. Quarterback, running back, great examples of that. Top end of the wide receiver board, also an example of that. But as you start to get down to the bottom of wide receiver, tight ends the same way as you see here with wide receiver, there are ways to generate that leverage. So just make sure you're forcing that in. Because of how soft the pricing is, the one thing I'll say, guys, is that it's sometimes, it's real easy, I should say, to go out there and not take that differentiation, because with how soft the pricing is, you can pretty much play whoever the heck you want. And if you spend all of your salary, you might be way chalkier than what you want to be. So just maybe leave some salary on the table. It's not a bad idea to go out there and force in one of those 3 or 4K players, especially if you're in those large field GPP contests. And lastly, we'll go through some of these tight ends. What I'd like to point out here at tight end is you're going to do a lot of correlation with your quarterbacks at this position, but my flex is probably not coming from tight end. I went a lot of those cheaper wide receivers as my last man in at flex. These tight ends just have a lower ceiling than what you have at the wide receiver position, and especially if you're trying to win like a 50 to 100,000 entry contest, unless one of these tight ends is just absolutely going off, something that we wouldn't expect, you're probably not going to want the 2 tight end setup. So I'm just probably looking for 1 tight end out there in most lineups. And to give you a few of my favorites, in terms of projection, it loves Schoonmaker with Jake Ferguson currently projected as out. He is questionable, but in terms of my projections, I've got him out right now. Cole Kmet's got a solid projection at 2.44x, also 2.46x and 2.6x out there on Jonnu Smith. So even your spend ups that are a little bit chalkier are some of your better plays on the entire slate. So, if you're going to take a chalkier tight end, just make sure that you're really going after some of that differentiation over there at the wide receiver position. If you're spending up, you're taking, some chalkier wide receivers. Maybe you don't have as much differentiation at that position. That's where you maybe want to go down and take a Brock Wright. Hope that he scores a touchdown for the Lions. Take a Theo Johnson. He's sub 10% owned. He's the starting tight end out there for the Giants. Could get there with some PPR usage. If Jake Ferguson is truly rolled out, we've seen Span Ford really increase his usage in production the last few weeks. Like maybe he's in play down there at $2,700. Just like wide receiver, these tight ends could get there with a touchdown, 2-3 catches out there with PPR production and get to the optimal lineup that way. So I wouldn't recommend really anyone from Brock Wright down, maybe outside of Theo Johnson, out there in like a single entry or smaller field GPP. But the large field GPPs where you have to get different to the field, I think that this is a really decent range to go out there and consider. And then lastly, we're going to go through the defenses here. So you got the 6 defenses here on the slate. You've got these top 2 as extremely chalky. You've got the Cowboys defense going against Drew Lock. It is over 30%, which is, in my opinion, not the best play because the Cowboys have been a little bit of burnt toast this year. They have not had the best defense for sure, particularly when defending the pass. And then the Lions defense against the Bears, I more so get because they're 10-point favorites. But at 26% owned, like I'll just almost by default fade these top 2 and then go to these bottom 4 defenses. It's a crapshoot to go out there and get the right defense, especially large field GPPs. Usually I just try and punt out there at defense, try and take some of the cheaper options, which coincidentally are also the 4 lowest owned defenses out there for tomorrow. So, you don't feel great fading Tua. You don't feel great going against, actually I do feel great going against that Dallas offense. So 14.6% is probably my favorite defense would be that Giants defense. You don't feel great fading guys like a Jared Goff, a Jordan Love down here at these bottom 2, but they're turnover prone at times, particularly Jordan Love here in 2024. And if they take one of those for a defensive touchdown, well, that just all but guarantees that would be the optimal defense. So I think there's a lot of variance out here at the defense position, as you've probably seen over the years. So my recommendation is typically to try and get some leverage at that spot, as it's almost free leverage to the field. And especially when it's the cheaper defenses that give you a little bit more salary savings with the rest of your lineup, I think there's some upside to going out there and taking that kind of play. And now for the prop side of things, where I've got 2 props here on Underdog and Prize Picks, you might want to consider adding to a few slips yourself. So we're going to start here on Underdog, where I've got this over on Caleb Williams passing attempts, who are underdogs against the Lions, 9.5, 10.5 point underdogs, depending on which book that you're looking at. And a lot of sports books have Caleb Williams juiced towards the over at 33.5. In fact, Prize Picks this morning had Caleb Williams up at 34 attempts. He went back to 33.5 just about an hour ago. I'm not currently sure where his projections stands, but the one thing's for certain, you shouldn't be getting an extra payout by taking this over at 33.5. If anything, books are favoring this towards that side. So if anything, I think these multipliers should likely be flipped. So with them being huge underdogs, I agree with the sentiment that Williams is going to pass more. You give me a little bit of that sportsbook line value and a payout boost, and you can see why I want to play this over on this prop. So I'm going to match that up over here with this Malik Neighbors over on receiving yards. He's at 66.5 over here on Underdog. A lot of the other major books around the industry have him at 67.5. And because DeVito is now listed as doubtful out there for tomorrow, I think there's a really good chance that Drew Lock is playing quarterback, which is an upgrade in my opinion over what we had there with DeVito. DeVito, not really a big downfield passer. Drew Lock, for as much crap as a lot of people will give him, has a pretty big arm and is not afraid to use it with his downfield usage. A player like Neighbors that can high point the football, is all about those big plays. That is music to his ears. I mean, he has been very vocal about not getting the ball there on offense. I think that they're probably going to try and force feed him a little bit, maybe because of those comments. But then you give him a quarterback like Drew Lock that is a lot more willing to engage further down the field. I think it's going to do kind of like what you saw George Pickens get with a Russell Wilson. As a Steeler fan, I got to see Justin Fields, the first few weeks. He was very efficient in terms of the ground game, but he did not unlock that passing attack at all. Partially because he wasn't engaging further down the field. Somebody like Neighbors needs a quarterback to give him those touches to go out there and post the production that you saw with Daniel Jones. So as the year went on, I'm not sure the disconnect that happened between those two. Obviously last week with DeVito, he didn't have the best week either, but Drew Lock is a better style of quarterback out there for Neighbors, and with that slight little bit of line value at 67.5 on other books, that's why I took the over there for a 3.12x payout. So there was a third prop I actually had for my 3-leg slip that I took myself, but the prop unfortunately ended up getting bumped. So if you guys want to catch all the props before they bump over there, make sure to check out my Patreon page for all of that as well. On top of all these projections that you saw in the DFS section, I'm also posting all the different props that I'm taking over there too. So make sure to check it out in the link in the description of the video. And now for 2 props here on Prize Picks. So 2 different props that we're mixing in on this side. First one's going to be this over on David Montgomery touchdowns, who's going against his former team. A little bit of a revenge narrative, if you may say, but he's like nearly minus 200 to score in all the major books. That would include Pinnacle, where you have the yes and the no option. He was minus 190 there the last time that I checked, and I think because he has that revenge narrative going, he's got a better chance to get the first crack at the end zone between him and a Gibbs. You've seen that kind of alternate week to week. It's hard to predict who's going to get the first crack down at the red red zone, but against his former team, I would say that there's a boosted chance that is going to be David Montgomery. So he's the more bruising of the two backs. The Bears defense is relatively stout against the run. I don't think that's going to stop the Lions by any means. I mean, they're 10-point favorites. I think that really tells you everything right there. But that kind of game script is only favorable out there for David Montgomery. And you give me that slight narrative on top of that, I'll play it even as a goblin prop. So the unfortunate aspect is that it does lower the payout, puts it at about 2.5x. But given that he's about minus 200 to score, is something that I'll go out there and eat. And then the other side, I went out here and mixed this under on Rico Dowdle touchdowns, who he was minus 125 on a few books that had the no option for his touchdown prop, and he's not been scoring a lot of touchdowns this year. If you take a look at his record, it's been more PPR upside out of the backfield. They've not been a very effective rushing offense down there in the red zone either. And while I do think this matchup is favorable for them, they're going to be the favorites for the first time in a few months, seemingly at least the last 4 weeks out there for the Cowboys without Dak Prescott. But they're not sizable favorites against the Giants either. So with the slight value towards the under, the fact that he's had such a good track record at hitting the under on this prop all year is why I'm going to take it over there with David Montgomery. So it's only 2.5x because we have that goblin prop, but it's not the worst, especially if you can find a good pairing for it. And if you haven't already played the free square over there for Tyreek Hill, you can get this up to a 4.5x payout. So that was something that I did myself with the limited unit size out there on the promo, and then ended up running these two for a 2-man as well over there on my Patreon page. So just a few pieces of exposure that I've already gone to for the Thanksgiving slate. And on the Patreon page, you can find all the different props that I'm taking over the next day or so. But it's all I've got out there on the prop side of things. Go out there and crush it out there for tomorrow. Alrighty guys, that is all I've got for the Thanksgiving slate preview. Before you hopping out of here, go ahead and smash that like button. Also subscribe to the channel so you guys don't miss any of the content in the future. And also comment down below who you've got as the top fantasy scorer on the slate. If you can give me the top Draftkings score there for the 3-gamer, you will win a free month access over there to my Patreon page to give you all the DFS projections I'm doing there for the NFL, as well as on the prop side of thing with Underdog and Prize Picks. So make sure to enter that giveaway. Enjoy your Thanksgiving feast over there with your family and friends tomorrow, and maybe we go out there and make tomorrow a profitable one. Hopefully I see a few of your names towards the top end of those GPPs, and on the prop side of things, hopefully you can go out there and make it a profitable one as well. But it's all I've got out there for my exposure out there tomorrow. Best of luck, and let's go out there and make it a good one.